Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Kurdish national movement, with its various factions, had high hopes that following its active participation in the successful fight against the Islamic State, hoping it will be rewarded and its aspirations for statehood fulfilled. To further discuss the latest developments, I'm joined here in the studio by Professor Ofra Bengio, who's a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Sagnic, who is a coordinator of Kurdish Studies program at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the current situation of the Kurdish aspiration.
It seems that the hallmark of the Kurdish national movement has been always ups and downs, at least ever since the early 1960s, when the first connections between Mullah Mustafa Barzani and the Mossad, the Israeli security organization in Paris, started. They were supported by Iran and by Israel, and then they were betrayed by Iran and the United States in 1975. And then again, of course, Saddam Hussein acted against them. And in 1991, the Americans became something of a patron for the Kurds following the Saddam onslaught against the Kurds in Iraq. And now, again, after having been used by the American-led coalition, it seems as if they are betrayed, and Secretary of Defense Mattis and other American officials have warned Masoud Barzani not to hold the referendum, which was to lead to Kurdish statehood. He did not obey their advice. They were pushed by the Iraqi security forces out of Kirkuk and other places. And it seems as if one has to sum it all up, as if the Americans have decided that the state of Iraq, the wholeness of the state of Iraq, is more important than rewarding their allies, the Kurds, and even being helped by Iran and the militias, the Shiite militias, which Iran supports, is more important than helping those who help them.
And that's on the Iraqi front, on the Syrian front?
On the Syrian front, of course, the Americans have to acknowledge what is happening with the Turks. And therefore, even though without Kurdish assistance, they wouldn't have triumphed over ISIS in Raqqa, they have now decided, if not to disarm the YPG, at least not to rearm, to go on with arming the Kurdish fighters and only give them whatever they need for what is called a police force, which is self-defense, riot control, but nothing that will enable the Kurdish organization to become an adversary for Turkey.
Just for the sake of our viewers, the YPG, the most significant force within the SDF alliance, which was the US-backed alliance fighting the Islamic State. Professor Bengio, how do you perceive the current situation?
What I see is the Americans are, shooting themselves on the legs, themselves and the Kurds as well, because what they are doing, they are strengthening the Iranians in such a way that they are really rushing to the Mediterranean. And what they were doing, they thought that they would keep Iraq as one unit, but it will not happen. It has never happened. Iraq has never been a unified or united place because there are too many groups and too many communities and two nationalities which have been groping with each other, the Arabs and the Kurds. And, all the wars that have been taking place throughout this century and the last century, it was due to the fact that we are talking about two national movements. And the Americans seem to not to understand the situation, and that's why they are doing things which will be harmful to them, because they will lose more and more ground in Iraq, and maybe also in Syria, because the Russians in Syria will probably continue supporting the Kurds in Syria, and the Americans will lose ground in Syria as well. So what their policy is really, one cannot understand their policy at all. I hope they do understand.
Could they disregard, however, their NATO ally Turkey with regard to the northern Kurdish regions, where they were explicitly stated by the government in Ankara that as long as the United States continues to assist the Kurds in their ongoing aspirations for autonomy or a relative autonomy in that region, the Turkish government could not apply full friendship or relationship with the United States?
Yeah, the relationship between Turkey and the American has nothing to do right now with the Kurds. Yes, it started with it, but there are so many other problems between Turkey and the Americans. And actually, the Americans disregarded the Turkey for a long time when they supported the YPG, and Ankara again and again, tried to stop them from doing it. And the Americans didn't, because at the time they thought that the most important thing to do is to fight ISIS or ISIL. But now when things have changed, they, again, they are dropping the Kurds.
Mr. Sagnic, how do you perceive the current situation?
The Americans used to say, we will hit the ISIS today, and we will deal with the ramifications later. And what we're seeing in Iraq is definitely the ramifications of a significantly changed balance of power. In 2013, when ISIS took over some 40% of Iraqi territories, the Iraqi army was not capable of standing on its feet, and Ayatollah Sistani, the Supreme Shiite leader, issued a fatwa calling for popular mobilization, which changed the balance of power in the country entirely, because the U.S. government was focusing on countering ISIS and was postponing all the details to the post-ISIS period. And one of the details that was put aside was actually the Kurdish aspirations for statehood. And interestingly, again, the Kurds were able to enlarge their territorial control by 40% in the course of several months while fighting against ISIS, which included the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, the strategic areas of Sinjar, Rabia, and its environs, strategic assets of the Mosul Dam, were under Kurdish control, and the Kurds were definitely expecting a military move by the Iraqis and the militias supported by Iran, no matter if they would hold a referendum or not. So the referendum can be regarded in through two perspectives. The first perspective is that is definitely the aspiration of the Kurds in all four parts of the historical Kurdistan to declare statehood or to achieve some sort of a sovereignty over Kurdish populated lands. But on the other hand, given that the Kurds were expecting some sort of a military move against them after ISIS would be annihilated in Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government may have also tried to use the referendum as a legal framework for its rule and control over the disputed territories, by hoping that a popular vote would bring international support for the Kurdish Authority in the face of a potential Iraqi military maneuver against them in the disputed territories. It didn't work out because the U.S. concerns were much different. First of all, the only standing U.S. ally in Iraq is the Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. And the joke is that if Haider al-Abadi dies of a heart attack, the U.S. will have no one to support its interests in this country. So the U.S. government was explicitly telling the Kurds that a potential for clashes between the Kurds and the Iraqis would empower Iran ahead of the elections in 2018, so that Abadi would have lost his power to Iranian-backed factions in Iraq. But the Kurdish response was related but structurally different, expressing that Iran is already strong in Iraq, and Abadi's chances are conditioned by the populist Shiite militias, so that this conflict of understandings and perspectives led to the catastrophe that happened in October.
So why, Mr. Olin, when we're talking about Kurdish knowledge of the situation, nobody disputes, of course, the Kurdish involvement in defeating the Islamic State in Iraq, specifically or in particular in the northern Iraqi regions. But when it came to understandings of the Kurdish government and the Peshmerga forces of an imminent attack by the Mobilization Front or the El Sha'bi organizations of the Iranian-backed militias and the Iraqi government, why didn't they just stand up and fight back?
Well, it's perhaps the tragedy of the Barzani dynasty, always to prop up the hopes of the Kurdish nation, and then find that there are not enough forces supporting them. A year ago...
Not enough Kurdish forces supporting them.
Not only not enough allies. Kurdish forces is something else. Of course, the intra-Kurdish rivalries and the fact that they are dispersed between at least 4 countries. But a year ago, Masoud Barzani was on a secret visit to Israel, and he met with the most senior officials here. And again, he had high hopes that Israel could have some leverage in Washington. Israel came out for him in various forums, calling for support for the Kurds. But this was not enough because neither in the administration nor on Capitol Hill was the Israeli support enough to sway the American policy. And it's really strange that perhaps for the first time, the most senior positions in the U.S. administration, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, are all filled by people who have some experience in the Middle East. General Mattis was the commanding general of the Central Command. McMaster fought in Iraq. Tillerson, as the head of ExxonMobil, of course, knows the region, perhaps the Persian Gulf more than other parts. But nevertheless, they are all well versed in what is happening here. And yet, when faced with the choices that were described here, they decided that at least their notion of the Iraqi nation should take precedence over Kurdish statehood. Nevertheless, even though people have warned Barzani in advance that the time is not right, the time is never right. If one hears these calls, there will never be any move towards statehood. So he tried and failed and paid the price politically, but that does not mean that he had any other real choice.
Professor Bengio.
Yeah, I think that Barzani decided, and rightly so, to go for a referendum. Maybe his mistake was not to declare right away independence, because anyway, they are paying the price now. So at least if he had, declared independence, at least he would bring something to his people, some hope to his people. Yes, they will go to fight, etc. But I think this was his main mistake. But on the whole, I think there were 3 things that came together to bring the failure of this attempt. And this was, of course, the internal problem, the fact that the Talibanis decided to work with the Iranian and with Sha'bi and open Kirkuk to them. The other thing was what was happening between the nation, the world, which did not support the Kurds, and also the fear that there will be some backlash that will destroy all Kurdistan, destroy whatever they have achieved so far. So his idea was at least to try now to do some things in order to try and, bring some stability to the region, even though they are now under attack and they are under, they are not allowed to use their borders, their airports, etc. But they are trying to stabilize the situation so that to gain time and see where you can move forward after this setback.
Mr. Sagnic, why didn't President Barzani declare independence? What were his motives or interests to actually adhere to the international demands and the local demands as well, just after he already has brought about a referendum, which gave him a significant vote in order to say, yes, now we have the opportunity to vote independence?
Well, the answer is very simple. They lack the capacity of diplomatic capacity of upkeeping a country and secure recognition. Because the case in Iraq is different than the case in Syria or elsewhere. The case in Iraq for the Western world is a case that is an ally versus ally situation. The Iraqi government is an ally, no matter what, who comes to power. Even if it's going to be Nouri al-Maliki, the Iranian-backed hardliner, Iraq will stay as the country where the U.S. coalition since 2003 invested a lot of efforts. And same-wise, the KRG received a lot of Western investment. So it's a ally versus ally situation. The KRG hasn't been getting any benefits from Iraq since 2014, ever since it lost its budget share. It didn't get any weapons, it didn't get any ammunition, it's not receiving any diplomatic support from the central Iraqi government. So basically, the KRG has nothing to lose by declaring independence. But the concern is in the possible lack of recognition by at least some Western states and some neighboring states, of course, Turkey and Iran. The situation in the Kurdistan region proper, not in the disputed territories that were once controlled by the KRG, but in the Kurdistan region proper, could lead to a tragedy for the Kurds under an embargo, and coupled with intra-Kurdish rivalries. So we are sure that the KRG was not planning to declare an immediate independence after the independence vote on 25 September. But was looking for some sort of a traditional mediation between Erbil and Baghdad, because the U.S. Role in Iraq since 2003 has been a mediator between the semi-autonomous Kurdish region and the central Iraqi government, and the Kurds expected at least that after the referendum, the U.S. government would continue with its traditional role, trying to bring Erbil and Baghdad together for talks. But on the contrary, this time the U.S. supported the central Iraqi government against the KRG, and the KRG was fully aware of this after it started meetings with the coalition and Brett McGurk. Interestingly, the KRG was also placed under a diplomatic embargo after the referendum. The first meeting that a KRG senior official had with a Western official was with President Macron 2 days ago this week. And no Western politicians who visited the country, Iraq, went to Iraqi Kurdistan. So there was definitely a unified bloc, a Western bloc against KRG's independence. And KRG considers itself a natural Western ally, and it will always eye at what will be the Western response before taking any structural steps.
Well, the Kurdish population in Europe is quite significant, as well as in the United States. I have been following quite some extensive effort by the Kurdish populations there, especially in Germany and in France and in other regions, with protests and lobbying in various parliaments. How did the Europeans actually react to this? Because there was no unified voice with regard to supporting or rejecting, for that matter, the Kurdish bid.
The Europeans have seen the Soviet Union disintegrate to its 15 republics or so, but within these republics, you have seen many revolts which did not bear fruit. And we've seen Czechoslovakia break up into two countries, and Yugoslavia, of course. But the trend of the times is to let nations keep their sovereignty and fight any attempt, be it by Catalonia. We are going to see what's going to happen in Corsica. But we've seen many times Katanga in Congo and Biafra in Nigeria. It was a rare case of Pakistan being broken into two because India stood between the two halves, and therefore Bangladesh came into being. But for all of the support which the Kurds and others can have elsewhere around the world, eventually it's a club of powers. And these powers are not going to let a member of the club break apart just for the sake of fulfilling some idealistic notion of self-determination. It's power politics, and the Kurds have not managed to have enough of a nuisance power to let the world know that they will always resort to force. Even in the case of the Palestinians, only when King Hussein of Jordan announced that he is disengaging from the West Bank did the Palestinian national movement gain its acceleration.
Professor Bengio, we hear both Mr. Sagnic and Mr. Oren talk about how Western civilization is not very keen on separating various states. Why don't the Kurds then put their eggs in a different basket? For instance, Moscow, which has clear aspirations and has truly backed its intentions by preserving various regimes and making sure that its actors in the region are the stronger actor or the stronger player in the region.
First, I would remind you of the Mahabad Republic when the Kurds were allied with Russia or the Soviet Union and vice versa. And then at the end of the Second World War, the Soviets dropped them in one day and the whole story was finished. I don't think that the Russians are suggesting anything to the Kurds more than, federation or anything that comes near to independence. But regarding Europe, I think one should see that it is not true that no new states propped up. We know about Kosovo, for example. So when the situation will become maybe very bad in Iraq, there is a possibility that the Kurdistan would also rise up. Also, another point which I need to mention, you cannot make any comparison between Catalonia and Kurdistan. Catalonia is a story which has nothing to do with wars, with genocide, with all these problems between these two nations. So, I mean, if the world would like, or if Europe would like to support, they have quite a good reason why to support the Kurds.
Mr. Sagnic, when we look at the significant backlash that the KRG and the Syrians also, the Kurdish Syrians have also withstood, do you believe that this has discouraged them to the point of seeking alternatives to a country or statehood, or are they still full force hoping to establish a significant state that could be self-sustainable in the face of the various challenges at hand?
It's currently a crisis management policy in the Kurdistan region of Iraq because the central Iraqi government, when it started the military maneuver against the Kurds in the disputed territories of Kirkuk and other places, the declared objective was to going back to pre-2014 borders, namely before the ISIS expansion from Syria into Iraq. And then the Iraqi move was enhanced to push the Kurds to go back to pre-2005 or 2003 borders elsewhere in the disputed territories. It didn't stay there. The Iraqi government insisted on seizing control of a strategic border crossing, Fishkhabur, in the triangle of the Syrian, Turkish, and Iraqi borders, which is actually pre-2003 borders, the pre-liberation of Iraq borders. And the Kurds responded by defending their positions there and were able to stop there. So obviously, the central Iraqi government is aiming at reducing KRG's semi-statehood into a province, and it was vocalized by Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi last month, saying that the semi-independent status is over in the Kurdistan region. So it's a crisis management situation at the moment. The KRG is trying to keep the 2003 status quo, with regards to its territorial control, and the 2005 status quo with regards to its annual budget share from the overall budget of Iraq, which is 17% on paper. So it's a new beginning for Iraqi Kurds. They know that Iraq will have more crises in the future. The borders will change overnight. It changed overnight in 2014. It changed overnight in 2015. It changed overnight in 2017. It will change overnight in 2019. They know that they have to be prepared for it. They tried their chance. It was a bad luck for them. They had no support. Their military capacity wasn't enough for them to keep the territories they controlled. But they know if Erbil is secure, They know if the economy of Kurdistan continues to be stable, and if they continue to control, at least partially, the border crossings, which means an access to Turkey and Iran simultaneously, not an access to either Iran or Turkey unilaterally, then Kurdistan will be ready for the next round with Iraqis and the rest of the world.
Well,
One point,
please, very shortly.
Very shortly. I mean, the Kurds of Syria, I think, have studied the lesson from the Kurds of Iraq by now trying to make some arrangements with Assad before Turkey does the same thing, you know? So this is very important to point out.
Absolutely, and of course we can't exclude Turkey from this discussion. Mr. Oren, the Kurdish nationalism and also the population there in Turkey is quite significant and has also its ups and downs with the central government in Ankara. How do you perceive the challenges at hand and Turkish interests with regard to Iraq, which actually was quite supported by the Turkish government for quite some time now?
Yes, but for Turkey, the Kurdish problem is a domestic issue. It's not a foreign policy issue of how Turkey regards its relations with Iraq or the Iranian encroachment into Iraq. And because of the sensitivity of the Kurdish issue within Turkey, it's a foreign policy issue for the American administration, because whether the relationship between Washington and Ankara is bad or good, and it depends on the mood of Erdogan or other interests. Turkey is an important member of NATO, and the United States cannot unilaterally decide to relate in a different fashion to Kurdistan. The Americans have started with regarding the Kurds as expendable, and then they try to solve the humanitarian crisis of 1991. They don't want to take part in nation building, and they want to get out of the Middle East as soon as possible.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'll give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Professor Bengio, we'll start with you.
Turkey has started to change its, stance towards Kurdistan because now it sees that it is the loser. Who is the winner? Iran is winning Iraq, is winning the oil in Kirkuk, and this is something which now Turkey understands, and I think it will rebuild its relations with Kurdistan of Iraq. And another point, very important one, is the fact that the West and America does not pay any attention to the Kurds of Iran who could be a very important asset for trying to destabilize Iran.
Mr. Sagnic?
Well, I mean, if the Kurds of Iraq are convinced that the situation will not change and they can't declare statehood unilaterally, if Iraq stays as a Western ally, they may want to start thinking of how to de facto merge the two parts of Kurdistan, Syria and Iraq, and start thinking of maybe declaring independence as two parts from two countries, which will be much more stronger.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, unfortunately, so I'd like to thank Professor Bengio, Mr. Oren, and Mr. Sagnic for coming here today, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.